I apologize for blocking your view of the gorgeous mountains this morning, but we don't want to have a glare on the screen. And so if we could just bow our heads for prayer. Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the rain that you've been sending us and for the sunshine today. We ask that you will be with our presenters this morning and help us to have really good takeaways that we can apply to our own lives. Amen. Dr. Rick Rice is going to introduce our speaker, who will introduce other people, and I'm just going to sit down.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's a special day for many, many reasons. I won't list them all. Recovery from the inauguration, but very happy to have an opportunity to introduce a college friend of mine, Dr. Blount, a psychiatrist from the Minneapolis area, who developed an interest in Dietrich Bonhoeffer somehow several years ago, and became so involved in the Bonhoeffer Society and everything that he's actually produced a movie on the last days of Bonhoeffer that will have its national premiere this afternoon at 4:30. I've seen it. It's a remarkable movie about a remarkable man. I know you'll enjoy it. And now I'll ask Gary to come up and tell us about some of the other interesting people who are here and who have been involved in studying Bonhoeffer and producing this movie. And the time is yours and theirs, Gary. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you for hosting us. Thanks to all of you. Many of you have probably heard that we were coming and helped prepare the way. I want to introduce the two people with whom I partnered to take on this project. The first is Kevin Ekval. Would you stand? And his parents are visiting from Washington State. And the other person, thank you, Kevin. The other person is from Germany. He's just from Germany. He's been in the States several times, and he's studied in England. But he works as a photographer and a filmmaker in Dusseldorf, Germany. And we have all worked on this together for 3 years. Would you stand, Helmut Schlingensiepen? We'll get back to you. And we're actually stalling until our guest comes, and that would be Dr. Kieth Clements, who is involved in the second church service, making an announcement about the film this afternoon. If you think you might recognize the name Schlingensiepen, it's because his father is the author of, I think, what's considered by most Bonhoeffer scholars, of which I'm not one exactly, but I think most true scholars have devoted most of their careers to the study of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I think most of them would say his father's book is at the top of the list, and it's over here. It's a few years old. I don't know, is it in revision? It took a while to get it into English, and he's here to represent his father as well. He knows his father's mind very well. I want to thank David Larson, and I do recall the heritage of this Sabbath school class. I think it has something to do with Jack Bravancia way back when. Is that right? And David Larson, I think, is the biographer of Jack Bravancia. Is that correct?
Well, this really is a continuation of Roy Branson's Sabbath School, which had its own beginning, quite apart from Dr. Bravancia. And I am putting together a collection of essays, and there'll be a brief biographical portion to that book, but mostly it's essays, and he would have liked to have been here.
And thank you. And I associate David Larson with Jack Bravancia, and I associate Jack Bravancia with another celebrity who visited Loma Linda way back when, and it was about the time I heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. The other celebrity I refer to is also part of the German story, not exactly the German resistance, but that's Paul Tillich. And I don't know how many of you had the opportunity. I did not. I was a student at La Sierra, and for some reason didn't get over here in 1964, I think it was, shortly before Paul Tillich died. But he and Jack Bravancia had a, I think, pretty high-level conversation in the church. So it's an honor, and thank you for allowing your leadership to talk and invite us to talk a little bit about where we are coming from in the story. I first heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer as a student at La Sierra College. I think it was 1964. It was a week of prayer, and I don't know how they organized their week of prayer at this time, but in 1964, it was a whole week, and all of us ended up in the church every day, and a man with a fine Scottish accent presented discipleship, or as it was then called, the cost of discipleship. Anybody remember who that was? Who was an early Adventist follower of Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Edward Heppenstall. I've been asked many times by scholars and other hangers-on, like in the Bonhoeffer Society, how in the world did you hear about this story in the 60s? In the 50s, as we'll hear from Kieth Clements, the story was picking up, I think, some momentum. And certainly in Germany, a lot of professional theologians and others had been talking about Bonhoeffer. A lot of controversy around Bonhoeffer at first, for several years, I'd say, even after he kind of worked his way out of the reputation of being a traitor to his country. And here's our man, Kieth Clements. You'll have the floor very soon. Keith, just come right here too. And so when I would tell people in the Bonhoeffer Society, I heard this story at a small Christian college in California, and it really grabbed me around the throat. And at first, for several years, I had the illusion that this was my private property. Then I started running into people, strange circumstances, who volunteered something about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I knew that the story was getting around. But it wasn't until about 12 years ago, after reading Cost of Discipleship and Life Together and trying to read ethics and a couple of other things, that I started to get deeper into the story because I had a completely unanticipated opportunity to meet Dietrich Bonhoeffer's niece, who lived next door to him. Even then, she was getting up in years, but she was on one of her final tours of the United States. And I saw a little ad in the paper about Dietrich Bonhoeffer's niece is coming to this little Lutheran church in Minnesota. And indeed, it was a little Lutheran church with maybe 40 people turning out, kind of like Dietrich Bonhoeffer's churches in England. 40 or 50 people, I think, showed up usually as a pastor there. So I met his niece, and I wanted to get deeper into the story, the family, what she knew about him. She knew a lot about him. In fact, she was the first person, I think, who tried to effect his rescue from prison by taking a plumber's uniform into Tegel prison, and probably was in the chain that alerted the Swedish embassy in Berlin that you have a VIP prisoner who's going to get sprung from Tegel prison here soon. So my wife Lee and I, who may join us, I hope so, sat down with her at her home maybe a year after I interviewed her informally in Minnesota, and we did a formal interview that eventually was published in Spectrum. And she's still alive, but through her and through other members of the Bonhoeffer Society, we've met all kinds of people who were either involved in the resistance, a couple of them directly, like her. I would say she was a teenager at that time when she took the uniform into the prison. But others, and the one I would mention would be a guy named Schlabrendorf. I will not write it on the board here, maybe. His father was the young lieutenant who, with his cousin in early 1943, got the bomb onto Hitler's plane. I think that was the closest they ever came to assassinating him. And that's another story. But his son was born just about the same time I was born. And we've compared notes 3 or 4 times as we've gotten together. And it turns out that while my dad was in North Africa trying to do his little part to defeat Germany in North Africa, his dad was getting this bomb onto the plane in Germany trying to save Germany. His dad survived the war, wrote a book about the resistance, and that has been a wonderful link to the story, and the son of Schalkendorf, is very active in the Bonhoeffer Society as well. Now, I thought I was gonna have a chance to ask Helmut and Kevin to give a little something of their perspective. They may still have a chance, but we're gonna preserve the choice time for our guests. Dr. Kieth Clements is the former, okay, I'm gonna say this slowly, General Secretary of the European Conference of Churches in Geneva, which is in effect a European presence for the World Council of Churches in the same building, suite of offices. He did that for several years. And he and I have talked a few times about how do the Adventists fit into your career. So he was in Geneva for many years, and then he has been a pastor, I believe. He certainly has been a scholar, graduate of both Oxford and Cambridge, doctorate from Bristol, where he lives. I want to acknowledge Paul Magane. Paul Magane helped edit the sermon in the film. He is a chaplain in San Diego, in chaplain training. Great friend, pastor from Minnesota. Back to Keith. Sorry.
What do you want me to do?
I want you to stand up here and say anything you want, and they're gonna have a lot of questions because of your whole 5 decades maybe devoted to, you've written 5 books on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Please. I say 15, 20, 25.
Ready?
Yes.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, brothers and sisters, for this opportunity to speak to you. It's great to be here. I always have to apologize when I come to the States because I come from the land where English was invented and spoken properly, so I do not speak with an accent. But this is a great opportunity, and it's wonderful to be associated with this film that you're going to see later today. I don't know of any evidence that in his 2 visits to the States, have we got some technology on the way? Thank me now.
Okay, thank you. Right, we're ready to go.
I don't know of any evidence that when he was here on 2 occasions in the 1930s, Dietrich Bonhoeffer actually met Adventists in America, but I'm very much aware that there's interest in Bonhoeffer in the Adventists as much as in any other church community around the world. But of course, he is found all around the world today. You can find icons of him in Catholic churches in Rome, in a Baptist church in Melbourne, Australia, and of course, on the west door of Westminster Abbey, there is a statue of Bonhoeffer with 9 other 20th century Christian martyrs. But the point of, I think, our exercise today is to say, how can we bring Bonhoeffer down from the niche where the effigies are placed into our real world today? I think it's always surprising how directly Dietrich Bonhoeffer does speak to situations far removed in space and time from his own, one which ended so cruelly on the Nazi gallows over 70 years ago. John de Grucci, another Bonhoeffer scholar in South Africa, tells of how once he invited Eberhard Bethge, the closest friend and biographer of Bonhoeffer, and the recipient of his famous letters from prison, and his wife, his niece Renata, whom Gary has mentioned, to South Africa during the days of the anti-apartheid struggle in the 1970s. Because many Christians in South Africa were becoming inspired by Bonhoeffer's example of the confessing church and its resistance to racism in Nazi Germany and its relevance to South Africa today. And after one of these lectures, someone raised their hand and asked the question, when did Bonhoeffer actually come to South Africa? And the answer was never. But he seemed to speak so directly to their situation in the 1970s, in the struggle there. I would just like to say how Bonhoeffer speaks to me, and I believe others today, simply by citing some of his utterances. How does peace come about? He asked an ecumenical conference in Denmark in 1934, when the world was rearming again. He said, does it come about through a system of political treaties, investment of international capital, through big banks, through money, or through rearmament? No, he said, through none of these, for the single reason that in all of them, peace is confused with safety. That's a challenging thought, isn't it? There is no way to peace along the way of safety, for peace must be dared. There's an element of trust comes in at some point or other. What more provocative word for today, a world which after the great hopes of 25 years ago is again lurching towards nationalism and militarism, certainly in Europe. How do we secure peace? By making our own nation or our group of nations into a kind of fortress, secured from the rest of the world, pretending that we are morally superior to them, so everyone different must be kept out. From his great book, Discipleship, or some of you may know its earlier English title, The Cost of Discipleship, Nachfolge, Discipleship, written in the midst of the German church struggle, when he was leader of an underground seminary for the Confessing Church. Because I think this gets to the heart of why he's so relevant, because he goes so deep. Christ has taken on this human form. He became a human being like us. In his humanity and lowliness, we recognize our own form. He became like human beings so that we should be like him. In Christ's incarnation, all of humanity regains the dignity of bearing the image of God. Whoever from now on attacks the least of the people attacks Christ, who took on human form and who is in himself has restored the image of God for all who bear a human countenance. In a world where we are beginning again to talk about difference as division and threat, Bonhoeffer begins with how we are united in one humanity under Christ. Christ is not the possession of Christians. Christians are those who claim by their faith to be possessed by Christ, but Christ is the one who has identified himself with all humanity in its sin and its need to the point of the cross. And so we begin the whole exercise of working out God's purpose for us with the fact that God wills united humanity, bridges, not fortresses or fences or barriers. As we used to say in Europe during the Cold War, the walls on earth do not reach to heaven. From the essay he wrote about Christmas 1942 to his friends and family in the German resistance. He wrote this as a Christmas present, and it was just a few months before he was arrested in prison. It remains, he calls it the view from below. It remains an experience of incomparable value that we have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below. The perspective of the outcasts, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed and reviled, in short, from the perspective of the suffering. If only from this time bitterness and envy have not corrupted the heart, then we come to see matters great and small, happiness and misfortune, with new eyes. Our sense for greatness, humanness, justice and mercy has grown clearer, that we learn indeed that suffering is a more useful key than personal happiness in exploring the world in contemplation and action. He was speaking as someone from a very secure, prosperous background, now in the resistance, found himself among the outsiders in his own society, and of course even more so as he was about to be imprisoned. But I think he's also addressing us in our Western societies, in which we are moving again, I think, to above and below attitudes. Societies in which, quote, success is measured almost entirely in personal economic achievement and celebrity status. Someone in our own British press once said, people today are anxious to be famous just for being famous. In which the goal is to rise above the trials and tribulations of life in general. But no, where we believe through his faith in Christ, Christ invites us to see what it is like for people on the side of the road, as it calling out for help. And that is not an attitude of condescension. He has a wonderful sermon he preached in one of his churches in London in the 30s, when he said the Christian views serving the underprivileged as a way of honor for themselves. Or we might say that the view from below is about our own liberation from the false gods of success economically and in other ways and in the search for power. And then there's what he says about rhetoric and the way language is used in public life, in the media. Speaking from his own situation when he was in prison. In one of the novels he tried to write in prison, he has one of his characters saying, "I'm speaking to you to protect from misuse the great words given to mankind. They don't belong in the mouths of the masses or in the headlines of the newspapers, but in the hearts of the few who guide and protect them with their lives. It's never a good sign when what has always been the calm and firm possession, the unquestioned attitude of all well-meaning people in the country is loudly hawked in the streets as the very latest wisdom. Those who are guardians of genuine values with their lives, their work and their homes, turn in disgust from the ringing rhetoric that is supposed to turn the masses into prophets. What well-meaning person can still utter the degraded words freedom, brotherhood, and even Germany? Let us honor the great values by silence for a time. Let us learn to do what is just without words for a while." Well, I know in my own country, we are worried, should be worried about the great words, freedom, patriotism, even Christianity, even God, are bounded around for either political or commercial purposes. And from that poem he wrote while in Table prison, as he put into words what he felt an honest German should be saying now, "We saw the lie raise its head and failed to pay homage to truth. We saw others in direst need, and our own death was all in fear." The lies, the particular lies, we're not just talking about fake news, though we could talk about fake news and so on, or post-truth society, but the lies that are subtly told in society about the people who are perceived by some people to be threats or as not belonging to us at all. The lies in Nazi Germany were being told about the Jews, the gypsies, the homosexuals, and so on, supposed threats to their country. And that lie eventually culminated in the total criminality of Germany, its unleashing of another war, and the ultimate evil of the Holocaust. And that's what led Bonhoeffer into the conspiracy, to make some kind of atonement for that lie that was being told. But talking about the conspiracy, I'll just come to the end now, is where many people get a bit afraid of Bonhoeffer, isn't it? This gets a bit tricky. This pastor who previously had espoused effectively the non-violent cause, who wanted to go to India to study with Gandhi, who called the churches to declare against war and armament in every shape and form, now joins a conspiracy which involves complicity to assassinate the head of state. Romans 13 again, let everyone be subject to the authorities of state as authorized by God. What happens to that? And it is a real question. If we aren't frightened or disturbed by this question, then we're false admirers of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, because it was a troubling question. He himself took this very seriously. In his writing of his book on ethics during the war, while he was in the resistance, he struggles with the question, how do we cope with guilt? In a situation where millions of people are being murdered by the state, what does it mean to be innocent any longer? Do we mean simply withdrawing from the struggle and saying, my hands are clean? How are your hands clean if you've withdrawn from the struggle and allowed the murder, the Auschwitzes of this world to be built and carry on their work? you have to be prepared to become guilty, in one sense, for the sake of the greater good. Gary has mentioned his association, friendship with Renata Baker, the wife of Eberhard, who's the greatest friend of my own friend. I too have had that privilege. I shall always remember Eberhard once telling me how one night in about 1941-42, he was with Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law Hans von Donani, who was the mastermind of the civilian side of the resistance and the conspiracy, and with Dietrich himself, by the fire in the Donani's country home outside Berlin, and they were discussing resistance and what it involved. And Donani said to Dietrich, look, it says, Jesus says in the Gospels, those who take the sword will perish by the sword. Doesn't it? Does that mean us? Because we are taking the sword, aren't we? And it says, you never forget the look on Dietrich's face when Dietrich said, yes, Jesus says those who take the sword must accept the consequences. And if that means us, so be it. You have to accept responsibility. The times are so awful here that it requires people who are prepared to go that ultimate extent of action and to accept the consequence. It may be God will spare us and bring us through and save us, but if not, Germany requires us to have people who are prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice, even the sacrifice of their innocence. And that, I think, you will see underlined in certain aspects of the film we'll see later today. And one of my own treasured experiences of talking with Eberhard Baker in his home in near Bonn a few years before he died, was once asking him almost by chance, on the spur of the moment, where are the originals of the prison letters that Bonhoeffer wrote to him? And to I was thinking they'd be involved by now in some museum somewhere. He said, oh, they're here in my desk. He said, would you like to see one of them? Which one would you like to see? So he pulls out of the drawer a whole bundle of aging-looking papers, and Joe Helmut has seen this too. He said, which one would you like to see? And I said, well, the one he wrote on the 21st of July, 1944, the day after the assassination of Hitler failed. And Bonhoeffer knew what his own fate was now likely to be. And there it was almost like holding a papyrus of one of the epistles from the New Testament. Yeah. It begins, heute, today, this day of all days, this is what I want to say. And he goes in these most personal and most profound things he ever wrote, I think, when he says, I'm still discovering to this day that one only learns to have faith by living into full this worldliness of life. If one has completely renounced making something of oneself, whether it be a saint or a converted sinner or a church leader, the so-called priestly type, then one throws oneself completely into the arms of God. And this is what I call this worldliness. Living fully in the midst of life's tasks, questions, successes and failures, experiences and perplexities. Then one takes seriously no longer your own sufferings, but rather the sufferings of God and the world. Then one stays awake with Christ in Gethsemane. This is how one becomes a human being, a Christian. How can we become arrogant over successes or shaken by our failures when we share in God's suffering in the life of this world? If you say, should we take Dietrich Bonhoeffer seriously today? I say because we are still only just beginning to learn something of what he was learning. And we need to learn it for the sake of the church today, our world today, and our own souls, I think, today and tomorrow. I better stop there.
Questions?
Yeah, they're not too hard questions.
You are the one I turned to before plunging into this project. I had heard from another Bonhoeffer scholar that Bonhoeffer wasn't all that deep in the resistance. That he was a counselor to the resistance, to his brother-in-law, to others. That didn't
didn't sit very well with me, and I did a lot more reading and so forth. And I turned to you and you said something like he was very involved, he was involved in lots of details. We don't know exactly, and I'm still trying to find out exactly how involved he was with all of his travels. My impression is he didn't set about to assassinate Hitler. He set about to end the war before it started, or to end it once it had started, through his ecumenical contacts. Would you say Bonhoeffer, if you had to say yes or no, was part of the resistance, where we sort of put him in the film, he was integrally involved?
Yeah, I mean, the question of the language you use, I mean, after the July plot failed, you had only to be knowing that there was this resistance going on to get yourself hanged if you were discovered. No, he was not himself involved in the actual assassination plot of July the 21st, July 20th of 44. But the whole question is complicity. He was involved in the resistance circle, particularly because of his ecumenical contacts abroad, in Geneva and in London and elsewhere in unoccupied Europe. That made him a useful tool for the resistance, because it was very important for the resistance to know if a coup was attempted, would the Allied government support the conspirators? It was no good simply blowing Hitler's head off, and then what happens then? Sheer chaos. You had to be certain that the Allies would respect a non-Nazi government following. So that was part of the conspiracy. And yes, he was fully involved in that, as his meeting with Bishop George Bell of England in Sweden in 1942 made clear. Passing of information to the Allies was an integral part of the conspiracy. So he went into that and accepted responsibility for it.
Please don't leave. I just would like to interrupt you momentarily. If you could stand over here for the camera's sake.
Oh, beg your pardon.
Come up here, Professor Gang. This is Professor Jeff Gang, and he is writing a dissertation right now. He is writing a dissertation on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he is the one who brought these books. So we won't interrupt things further, but Jeff is our Bonhoeffer specialist.
Thank you.
Get in contact with him later.
Thank you so much. I'll try and be not much of a pathetic. Right. Yeah.
What would he do?
Well, this question is often asked. I'm sure he would also want us to ask the difficult questions as to what produces terrorism in the world today. Is it just sort of mindless evil which comes upon people, or does it arise out of particular contexts to which we have to respond? I'm sure he'd want to protect people from, as far as possible, the acts of terror that people want to carry out in Europe. We're particularly concerned, of course, as you've been in the United States, suffered terrorist attacks. But the all-out response to terrorism by effectively wanting to go to war, I'm sure he would want to say, let's think about that. What are you actually doing? Are you creating even more enemies by what you wanted to do? So I don't think you can simply draw Bonhoeffer into a war on terror, onto a war of any kind, but I think he would want to say, can we, in the end, there's going to be a dialogue between, put it this way, Christian West and those communities out of which terrorism is arising. That's going to be very difficult. But at some point we have to look for the opportunities where peace can be dared. And you think of some of the moments in history where peace has been dared, has been a matter of venture, as in change in South Africa. When it came about, there was acts of daring on both sides by the Afrikaner white government and Nelson Mandela and the ANC. In East and West, when you think of Willy Brandt going to Poland that time and kneeling at the memorial of the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland. You know, there is the need for those acts of daring, and there's no blanket solution to this at all, no blanket answer. It's a matter of, Bonhoeffer would say, of looking carefully for the opportunities, and if necessary, being prepared to wait. And waiting is not a very popular word in our culture either.
Keith, question up here.
Sorry, beg your pardon. I haven't got a chairperson to...
Do you think that he would agree that the ends justify the means?
He'd ask you to think really about what are the ends in it all, because you see, his question he and the conspirators faced was the end was a non-Nazi government in Germany. It was not simply the elimination of Hitler. There was a big discussion, in fact, within the resistance, and you'll see this comes out in the film at some point, about whether the elimination of Hitler was justifiable or not. There were still those in the resistance who said, no, we can't go and be as bad as Hitler himself, as it were, by murdering him. The end justified the means because in that case, the belief was that unless Hitler was eliminated, the end would not be reached, because he was the head of the command of the whole German military machinery. Unless you did eliminate him, there would still be a chain of command in effect, which would make us say we must still obey the Fuhrer. This was a debate, of course, was always possible in wartime situations. Take another example of the time, the obliteration bombing of German cities by, particularly by the British Air Force and the American Air Force too. For some people, the end was quite clear, which was simply to hit Germany as hard as possible, in revenge, as it were, for what Germany had been doing to other countries in Europe, including Britain. Now, that was not an end in itself that was acceptable to people like Bishop George Bell, Bonhoeffer's great friend, confidant, who said, you know, the end does not justify the means, whatever you do, because the end does have to involve respect for humanity and justice. And therefore, if you go on obliterating German cities, you are, in fact, becoming inhuman yourself, and you're not committing any act which will bear fruit in humanity and justice at the end. So it's a matter of thinking about what is the end that you're really looking for. Is it simply defeat of the other person, elimination of the other person, or is it the opportunity to create a new kind of society, justice, freedom? So the end will always be conditioning the means, yes. But it might certainly mean some uncomfortable means on the way. And of course, one of the ambiguities of the resistance is that it did bring a lot of trouble onto Germany. The number of people who suffered as a result of the failure of the plot was considerable in Germany. That was an ambiguity, a question they themselves had to live with. Yeah. So the two down here.
I think it will help us to understand a little bit how Dietrich Bonhoeffer operated during the resistance time. Because in fairness to the history, the German resistance was not widespread. It was not like a guerrilla war or something against Hitler. It was in high circle, especially military high circle, and a lot of them were German nobles. Basically, Bonhoeffer was part of Abwehr, which was Canaris, Admiral Canaris was the chief of the military intelligence, that was called Abwehr, and Bonhoeffer was part of Abwehr, and he operated kind of cover operation. Under this, he was under this mantle. He was sent by Canaris in England to contact the resistance, the Allies, and to have a separate peace with the Allies. Also in Switzerland, he went several times, and he didn't participate exactly in putting the bomb there. Stauffenberg did that. And but how Bonhoeffer was involved in all this? They had meetings before with Canaris and Count Molke and others, members of the German aristocracy, and they were signing meetings of these different minutes of different meetings, and all these papers, those they decided to destroy them, they didn't destroy them. And they were put in a farm in Zosser, I think, if I remember correctly. They were put in that farm, and when the Secret Service, the Hitler's SS discovered this, Bonhoeffer was involved in prison in Berlin, and from just before the Allies liberated Germany, he was hanged with Canaris and others.
Yeah, I mean, the connections get very close with the bomb business. Because in one of the previous attempts, the one that Gary had said earlier, the bomb actually went in Bonhoeffer's father's car, driven by Antoine Denani to one of the stations where it was going to be put on his plane. So it was very, very, very close indeed. But I think the distinction is relative, I think. If you accept complicity in what the whole project is about, Bonhoeffer felt he had to accept complicity in the use of violence. Even if he was not personally involved or pulling the trigger, he was accepting responsibility. And the challenge I think brings out is how do we measure our responsibilities in achieving justice in the world today? Or are we going to try and escape responsibility to keep our hands clear? And Bonhoeffer is the one who says, no way down that road. You are still going to be asked by God, as it were, what did you do for others? The end.
But I don't know if we have time. I have another question. If in your research you discovered something, because it was a lot of discussion after the war and a lot of writings about the role of Pope Pius XII. That was called by some Hitler's Pope, but others said that no, the Pope was involved in reaching a peace with the Allies, and the Vatican was very, very much involved in this with the German bishops. And
There's a new book last year that addresses that. It's, I think, semi-scholarly. It's entitled Church of Spies.
Yes.
Bonhoeffer is mentioned many times in
I
that
just
book.
read it.
You like it?
It's a very interesting area on which we have to say, I think this is maybe evasion, but there's a lot more coming out. There's still a lot more to come out.
Very interesting.
What is interesting, of course, is how towards the end of the war, towards the end of his time in the resistance, before he was arrested, he was working more and more closely with Roman Catholics in the resistance. And those contacts with the Vatican were important. He once visited Rome and the Vatican with his brother-in-law, Donani. So obviously there's a lot that necessarily probably will always remain hidden, but it was important. It's important to remember for the conspiracy, the relations with their allies and what was hoped to be their supporters abroad was crucially part of the exercise. There was no use doing something which the allies would take no notice of. In the end, the allies didn't take much notice of it, but the conspirators did their best to make them take it seriously. And there's now evidence, and this affects what we see in the film, that the governments in London, certainly, and in Washington, knew far more about the resistance, the German resistance, than they were letting on at the time, particularly through the information that was going into Switzerland, to Alan Dulles and people, and to London, through to MI6, as we call it. They did know a lot more about it than they were prepared to let on. It was William Churchill's get-out clause that said, well, of course, we can't take these conspirators seriously. We We know about the French resistance, we know about the Dutch resistance, and so on and so forth. But these Germans, they're keeping their heads down far too much. They did know. And of course, one has to remember that one problem for the resistance was that unlike the Dutch, the Poles, the Norwegians, the French, the German resistance had no government in exile abroad to plead their cause. They were stateless, you might say, as a resistance. They had to go on their own way, which is why contacts with the World Council of Churches office in Geneva and with Bishop Bell in England was so important to try and seek out these sympathizers. That was one of the challenges they were facing all the time. Sorry, but
I'm just wondering, the majority of the populace, were they supporting of the resistance and the conspiracy, or what was the percentage that would have supported the Nazis?
well, let's hear a German voice, Helmut.
That is a question that is hard to answer. I mean, most of the Germans definitely were at least trying to live their normal lives, so they followed the Nazis. They did what they could do just to survive somehow. There was a big debate how much you must have known about the Holocaust in Germany. And we know by now that you must have known it. Yeah, of course, I mean, my grandfather, he was in a confessing church. He was leading a seminary like Bonhoeffer was for a while, until the Gestapo closed it. And because he had a wife and children, they told him really close it. And so he went to Siegen and became a pastor. And he had to have a sermon on the question of loving your enemies on the next day. And he asked his wife, well, what do I have to say, and what can I leave away for not bringing you and myself into danger? And she said, you have to say what you have to say. But I know that he went to prison once, not because for that sermon, but I mean, you know, you took really daily risks. And there was a lot of resistance. You said that it was just a small group, which you are absolutely true. But I love to say, to tell a very short story of a man who was a teacher for religion. And he was asked the same story about, do I have to love the Englishmen if they are our enemies? And he was asked by a girl in his class, and he said, yes, the word of the Lord can't be changed by Mr. Goebbels, so the minister of propaganda. And the next day, the Gestapo came into that class, took him to the concentration camp, and he died. So it really was difficult to be in a resistance. And this mass of people who were against the Nazis, the heads of them were taken to prison in the very beginning, in the prison or the first concentration camp in Dachau. So those people like Bonhoeffer, Donani, who were covering themselves in the regime, they were the only ones who were able to try to get rid of Hitler after the war started. So it's a very difficult question. I mean, we do have the same question now with the alternative for Germany, with the rising new nationalism and sort of all that Nazi stuff which is coming up, which is, yeah, how to deal with it. I think you have them as well. It's let's say maybe it's 10% of the population in Germany, maybe 15. The question is how can we deal with them so they never get back to power again. And we are now having this problem that we're losing the British, our friends in the EU. I think we too agree that that we can cross borders. Most of us have the same currency. This is what maybe Bonhoeffer meant when he said peace must be there, the very moment. So when I was a little boy, I mean, we crossed the German border. I was Christian in the DDR, hidden. One of my mothers was hidden in a car because she was from Berlin, so she couldn't cross the border like my parents would. I was Christian by a pastor in the GDR in Berlin. So every time I cross that border, which isn't there anymore, I praise and say, wow, this is how far we got. Going to Britain as well, going to France and all that. So at the moment I'm a bit fearful that we are taking a step backwards.
Indeed, I think we are. Just going back to the story about how difficult it was to be in the opposition. Helmut's story about his father and so on reminded me, grandfather, of someone I met once on my first visit to the DDR, a pastor whose father had been also a confessing church pastor, and he said he hoped he would never have to suffer as he did. And I said to him, does that mean he went to prison? No, he said, it wasn't like that. He simply had a complete breakdown out of the pressure of not knowing who was the informer in his congregation. He said, that's what's broken. Okay? And that's the kind of pressure people were living under all the time. Undramatic, but real. Sorry, yeah, another question.
You have heard the phrase that give me freedom or give me death.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that fight is good for freedom? I mean, violence?
But it depends whose freedom you're talking about. I think if it's already in the possession of, I think I'm suspicious of this use of the word freedom very often, the way it's bandied about, because so often it means it's the freedom to do what you want and to preserve your own privileges. You've got to always contextualize freedom. Whose freedom are you talking about? In South Africa, at the time of the anti-apartheid struggle, you heard a lot of people from the white community saying, the ANC is a threat. The African National Congress is threatening our freedom. That was threatening the white freedom to live in places where they had, driven out the blacks to live. You're objecting to my time. Or was it the freedom which the black people wanted? The freedom to actually vote? Depends whose freedom and what sort of freedom you are talking about. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was interesting in that again and again he says to people in his background, his status in society as a minister, we must be prepared to forego our privileges. There's a lot of questions going to be asked about how our social group, how our intellectually privileged Lutheran families and so on behave during this Nazi time. Whatever we must do, we must not simply hang on to our privileges, which is often the code for people. I'm being led away. Where are you taking me now? So another one. This is
A question, will there be discussion after the movie this evening?
Yeah,
Yes, there will.
we'll carry on the discussion
Yeah,
after.
you get to hear from Kevin over here, and more from Helmut,
Yeah.
Daryl, and Jeff. I apologize for not introducing Jeff. Jeff is a tremendous resource. We just met last night, but he's steeped in Bonhoeffer, and he's going to help moderate the discussion tonight. The question, I'm just going to follow 20-second answer to the question, what did the Germans think? How did the demographic disperse about Bonhoeffer and the resistors and all? There were actually Gallup polls in Germany after the war. Germany got studied up one side and down the other by Americans, I think mainly, and there was a strong consensus that rising up against any government during war, as Bonhoeffer and group did, is verboten. It is not tolerated. There are no circumstances. Gradually eased into the 1950s, I'd say.
next Sabbath, hopefully, Ron Graybill, I don't know if he's here right now, is, speaking, and it looks like an interesting topic, so thank you for coming. We don't have our little benediction slip, sorry.